Very creepy date experience. We've all had bad dates, right? This is the only date I've had, to date, that rang every alarm bell and waved every red flag. I'll preface this by saying, I don't go on many dates, but when I do, I make sure I follow safety protocol by only meeting my date in public places. Let either family or friends know where I'm going, and park in a populated place close by to wherever we meet. Anyway, this date initially suggested we meet at his house to watch a movie and have a few drinks, and I said no, I don't feel comfortable with that, and I only want to meet in public. He seemed okay with this, but then brought it up a few more times, and I said, if money is an issue, we can meet up another time or forget about it altogether. But my date backtracked and went with my idea of meeting at a cafe that I chose, one that I was familiar with and equidistant to where we both lived. Anyway, he turns up in a 2-door car, this detail is relevant, and goes into the cafe, and I follow behind and introduce myself. After a polite introduction, things begin to get weird. I order a Coke, and he says, "Don't you want a drink? I was gonna pop in the bar and get one." This bar is connected to the cafe. I say no, I'm not drinking, and he looks at me like, WTF, as if I'm being unreasonable. I already explained in messages I don't drink as I'm on medication, so having to re-explain it again pissed me off. He seems disappointed and goes to order a cider from the bar while I get a table. Anyway, we sit down with our drinks, and my date immediately goes on about going back to his place again, even though the original plan was to stay here and order food, and I already stated that was not happening. He says something along the lines of having a few drinks and eating at his place, and I said we don't have to eat. We can just have our drinks and leave. He gets defensive and says he has money but prefers if we go back to his place. I make a joke and say, "You're not a killer, are you?" And instead of laughing it off, he stares at me uncannily and says, "You don't think I would hurt you, do you?" I laugh uncomfortably and say, "Of course not," but really, I'm relieved this date won't be going any further. My date suddenly says, "Are you gonna follow me in your car? Because that wouldn't make any sense. How about we go in my car? But I've got packages in the front, so you'll have to squeeze in the back, and I'll drop you back off at your car later." In reality, that made less sense than me following him in my own car, then driving home from his house after. The fact it was completely illogical made it even more creepy in my mind. Every alarm bell was going off at this point. I said, "Look, I don't want to go to yours, and your insistence is giving me the creeps." My date looks shocked and mumbles something about needing the toilet and excuses himself from the table. A few moments later, I see him through the cafe window, getting into his car and driving off. Massive bullet dodged, in my opinion. Also, the fact his car didn't have back doors made it even more sinister because imagine if something happened in the car and I couldn't escape. The following story is from a Reddit user that has chosen to be anonymous. As a teenager, I waited tables in a local restaurant to pay for the gas for my car. I met Mr. Creep there. In my naive mind, he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanting to date a 17-year-old. Leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get in my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. It made me feel safe. One night, I was leaving work and had just gotten into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle to try to open it. I looked into his eyes in the split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil I saw. From then on, I was terrified of him. But I didn't let on because I was afraid of what he might do. If I told him, I never wanted to see him again. After this, he constantly lied to try to impress me and tried to invent ways of being alone with me. But my instinct was to run, so I avoided him. About 2 weeks after this incident, the restaurant got robbed, and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all of my text conversations with Mr. Creep to the police chief in hopes it would help. Mr. Creep slithered away after that, but I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. He went on about his top secret military clearance, as well as a huge acreage he owned. It made me nervous, and I felt like he was trying to spring a trap or something. But I tried to put it out of my mind. Then, today, I was looking at posts about an unsolved murder when I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges, as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I am so glad to know he's locked up, but so overwhelmed about how correct my instincts about Mr. Creep were. I feel like I escaped him. Thanks for reading. I dated a hitman. I grew up in a small town in Alabama. A little bit after I graduated high school, when I was 18, I started dating this guy in his early 20s from a nearby city. He was a very handsome, tall, muscular male that we'll call Sean for this story. He told me on our first date that he used to be part of a very well-known gang in the United States. Sean explained that he'd only been part of this gang in his younger years because he'd grown up in a bad area and hadn't really had any other options. He also did have proof, including being aware of gang signs and having tattoos associated with that gang. I did Google to see if the tattoos and gang signs were in fact associated, since I know there are some people who like to lie about being ex-gang members and the like for some reason to seem cool. Sean didn't seem like the type to lie about that. I gave Sean the benefit of the doubt because he didn't really give me any bad vibes. I remember he was always a gentleman to me and treated me very well. So, of course, I didn't really suspect anything about him. We dated for a few weeks before the night that I found out the truth. I was staying over at Sean's apartment one night, and everything seemed pretty normal. This was the first time I'd ever stayed the night at his apartment, since I do tend to be a bit cautious. So, regardless of his background, it wouldn't have mattered. I just don't really like staying over at people's homes until I get to know them a bit more, and I do have an at least 3-date rule. I'd been too busy before that to really stay over at his place. So, that night when I was staying over, Sean's best friend was visiting for a bit. And that's when the red flags started to show up. It did seem weird to have a friend over when the girl you are seeing is staying over for the first time. And it was revealed to me in private that Sean's friend was another ex-gang member from a well-known gang that is the enemy to the gang Sean had been a part of. Of course, I can accept people all have their backstories, but it was definitely just a weird thing to suddenly tell me out of the blue. Additionally, Sean had not even told me his friend would be at the apartment that day in the first place. An additional note, Sean's friend did corroborate that he and Sean were both ex-gang members. Then, after Sean's friend had left, we were hanging out in his room. And this guy had a literal arsenal in his room. I'm not exaggerating when I say he had enough weaponry to arm a small militia. This included things like grenades, bulletproof vests, and an AK-47 or a gun similar to it, to name a few of the weapons he had in his room. Needless to say, that was the second red flag of the day. That night, we were in bed together, and I can't remember what led him to reveal to me what he said in our conversation. He confessed to me that he was, in fact, still a part of the gang he had told me earlier he was out of. So, of course, I was immediately giving him this look like, I'm sorry, what? Then he proceeded to go on and tell me that he actually was a hitman for the gang. And while he hadn't been active as a hitman as of late, he would still accept hits if they were given to him. The entire time he said this, he just looked me dead in the eyes with the most deadpan casual look, no feeling in his eyes, and spoke like he was talking about the weather. It was extremely creepy, and I knew right then that this guy was a straight-up sociopath. I don't doubt that he was lying. I've met people who try to get clout by lying about things like this, and he was definitely not one of those types. I stayed the rest of the night and then left the next morning and never talked to him again. I was definitely not going to keep on dating someone like that. And there's not really anything to the story after that. He never really tried to contact me either. I'm sure some people will probably wonder why I didn't just leave after he told me he was a hitman. I didn't think it was a good idea to react strongly and immediately storm out of the apartment. And I also didn't actually feel like he was a danger to me personally. But he definitely had the vibe of someone who had killed people. The reason why I recognize that this kind of vibe is another story. He was always very polite to me. But regardless, there was no way I was going to keep dating him, no matter how hot he was. A man knocked on my apartment door because he thought I was a prostitute. I live in an apartment building, and I guess there was a girl with a name similar to mine with long brown hair who moved in, and she was doing dates at her apartment through the internet. He thought I was her and followed me to my apartment. He said he went down to look at the register in the lobby and saw my name. Yes, we have first and last names posted for deliveries. And our names were really similar, like Kristen and Christine, or Brianna and Brianne. Anyway, he followed me like I said, and then looked at the registry downstairs, and just assumed I was this woman. So he knocks on my door. I answer it, and he tells me it's his birthday. Now, keep in mind, I have no idea about any of this. And so I say, "Oh, okay. Happy birthday." So then he says that he would give me $60 to go hang out with him and his friends. And that if I wanted to party, he would supply it for me. And that he and his friends would pay me for anything extra. I was completely confused. I said, "What do you mean? What are you talking about? I don't want to go to your birthday party. I don't know you." To which he replied, "Well, I saw your ad on the internet and replied, and you gave this address. And I saw you and blah, blah, blah." He tells me the story like I described in the beginning of this post. I said, "No, that's not me. I'm not a prostitute." Seriously, so strange and creepy. Edit. To be honest, I was still somewhat perplexed until I told a neighbor a few months later, and apparently, this woman got booted from the building because of the traffic to her apartment. I am glad the management didn't get us confused, as we live on different floors, and the complaints of traffic were specific to her apartment. Thank goodness.